When Chicago's most corrupt judge sentenced a 17-year-old coding genius to life in prison for a crime that never happened, he made one fatal mistake. He didn't know she could destroy his entire empire with a single phone call. Grace Harrington had been framed for arson after designing a security system that would have exposed a massive real estate corruption scheme. Judge Logan Kingsley railroaded her through a sham trial. No jury, no defense, no mercy. Just a life sentence handed down like he was ordering coffee. Grace stood there in chains, 110 pounds of quiet fury, while her 78-year-old grandfather Paul watched his world collapse from the gallery. But when Grace asked for that one phone call, she wasn't calling a lawyer. She was calling Federal Circuit Judge Vanessa Chambers, the mother who abandoned her 12 years ago, and the woman who now had the power to burn down everything Judge Kingsley had built. What happened next would shock the nation. They say the quiet ones are easy to overlook. The ones who keep their heads down, the ones who don't raise their voices, the ones who move through the world without leaving a ripple. That's how it starts. That's how the world tricks itself into thinking those people don't matter. But they do. Oh, they do. And nobody knew that better than the girl standing in front of Judge Logan Kingsley that cold Chicago morning. Her name was Grace Harrington, 17 years old, barely 110 pounds soaking wet. She didn't wear makeup, she didn't wear jewelry, she didn't wear a single thing that made her stand out in that sterile Cook County courtroom, except for the fact that she was there. Except for the fact that she was the one they decided to blame. She stood there with her wrists bound in front of her, those heavy silver cuffs hanging too big on her small, thin arms. The orange jumpsuit they gave her sagged off her shoulders like it had swallowed her whole. But she didn't shift, she didn't shake, she didn't cry. She just stood there, breathing so softly you almost couldn't tell she was breathing at all. And in the second row an old man sat clutching the edges of the wooden bench, his knuckles pale from the pressure. Paul Harrington, folks in Bronzeville called him Papa Paul, a man who used to fix computers in the basement of the local community center long before his arthritis started acting up. A man who'd raised Grace after her mother left. A man who'd taught her to keep her head high even when the world tried to push her low. And on that day, he sat still as stone, holding on to the only thing he had left, hope. Or maybe it was just habit. It was hard to tell the difference by then. Judge Logan Kingsley didn't even look up at first. He sat there flipping through a stack of papers like he was reading a grocery list, not about to take a girl's entire future away. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, leaned back in his leather chair and finally looked up like he was already bored with whatever he was about to say. In the case of the state of Illinois versus Grace Harrington, he started, his voice as dry as old chalk, this court finds the defendant guilty on all charges. Sentencing is as follows. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. No pause, no explanation, no moment to let the words settle like they actually meant something. Just a sentence delivered like it was nothing more than another check mark on his calendar. And the room didn't move. Nobody gasped, nobody shouted. Not the bailiff, not the court reporter, not even the prosecutor who'd spent the last 2 weeks painting Grace as some kind of criminal mastermind. It was like the whole courtroom was already on to the next case, the next headline, the next poor soul walking through those same doors. And Grace? She didn't flinch. She didn't lower her head. She didn't crumble like they probably expected her to. Instead, she did something else entirely. She turned, slowly, deliberately, she turned to face the people in the gallery, the few who bothered to show up. And for the first time that entire day, the first time since they dragged her into that courtroom, she spoke. I'd like to make a phone call. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It didn't shake or crack. But it cut through the air like a razor. Not because it shouted, not because it begged, but because it was steady. Because it was certain. Because it sounded like somebody who wasn't asking permission. Somebody who already knew exactly what that one phone call was going to do. The judge raised an eyebrow like he wasn't sure he heard her right, but he didn't say a word. The bailiff shifted his weight. The court reporter froze, fingers hovering above the keys. And Papa Paul, old Papa Paul, he blinked once. Just once. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a protest, it was a statement. And though nobody in that room knew what she meant, Grace did. Because sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one holding the match. And that's the thing about matches. You never really notice them until the spark catches, until it's too late to stop the fire from spreading. If you believe a 17-year-old girl shouldn't face life in prison for something she didn't do, type innocent below. This wasn't the end of Grace Harrington's story. Not even close. This was how it began. What happened next would change everything. They say you only get one phone call, just one. Most people use it to call home, call a lawyer, call somebody who might come running. But Grace Harrington? She didn't call home. She didn't call a lawyer. She didn't even glance toward her grandfather sitting alone on that bench, holding on like the world was slipping out from under his feet. No, she called someone else. The guards didn't care who she was calling. They never do. They think they've seen it all before. Another scared teenager dialing a disconnected number, another family member who wouldn't pick up, another moment they could check off without thinking twice. But Grace wasn't shaking. She wasn't second-guessing. She stepped up to that old payphone on the concrete wall, picked up the receiver like she'd done it 1,000 times before, and pressed the buttons, slow, steady, like every single number mattered. On the other end of that call was someone the world knew very well, Washington, D.C., 1,000 miles away from that small courtroom in Chicago. Under the marble columns of the federal courthouse, reporters crowded the steps throwing questions like darts at the woman walking down the courthouse steps. Federal Circuit Judge Vanessa Chambers, the most respected appellate judge in the Seventh Circuit, the first black woman to ever hold that position, the face of judicial integrity, at least that's what the headlines said. She stood there answering questions like she had a shield made of words. Constitutional law, appellate review, federal oversight. She hit all the right notes, smiled in all the right places, gave them what they wanted to hear, because that's what power looks like in D.C. Polished, rehearsed, controlled. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She ignored it. It buzzed again. Unknown number. She almost silenced it, almost, but something deep, something old, made her stop. Made her press that little green button and lift the phone to her ear. "This is Judge Chambers," she answered, already half ready to hang up. And then, silence. Not the kind that feels empty, the kind that feels like the air itself is holding its breath. Then a voice. Soft, steady, familiar in a way that made her knees nearly buckle. "It's me." 2 words. That's all it took. Vanessa's hand gripped the marble railing. The press conference around her kept moving, flashes popping, microphones reaching, but her world stopped cold. She leaned back, away from the cameras, away from the noise, pressing the phone tighter to her ear, like she needed to make sure it was real. "Grace," she whispered. Another breath, another pause. Then Grace spoke again. "You once said the law protects the voiceless." Vanessa's throat tightened. She hadn't heard that voice since Grace was a little girl, since she left her behind in Chicago all those years ago, chasing gavels and appellate opinions in Washington. She told herself it was for the greater good. Told herself she could fix the system from the inside. Told herself Grace would understand one day. But now here she was, on the other end of a prison phone. No tears, no begging, no blame. Just a reminder. Grace didn't wait for a response. She didn't have to. Now it's your daughter who can't be heard. Vanessa's back hit the marble wall like all the air had left the building. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. Because what do you say when the system you spent your life serving just swallowed your own child? What do you say when the one person you left behind is the one standing in the fire you helped build? Grace didn't say another word. She didn't have to. She hung up, quiet, final, like she'd already done all she came to do. And Vanessa? She didn't go back to the microphones. She didn't finish her statement. She didn't take another question. Instead, she walked straight past the reporters, past her security detail, past the marble columns that had made her feel so important for so many years, and into a silence so heavy it nearly dragged her to her knees. Because sometimes the loudest thing you'll ever hear is the voice you've spent your whole life trying to forget. But the truth was even more shocking. Federal Circuit Judge Vanessa Chambers stood frozen in the empty courthouse corridor, her phone still pressed to her ear, even though the line had already gone dead. She didn't move, couldn't move. The echo of her daughter's voice, just 4 simple sentences, had done what no legal brief, no appellate argument, no constitutional challenge had ever managed to do: shatter her. She had trained herself for moments like this. Years of sharpening her mind, controlling her breath, holding her composure in front of senators, Supreme Court justices, the president himself. She had built her career on never flinching, never folding, never letting anyone see her bleed, but this was different. Grace's voice hadn't just cracked something open. It had ripped right through the wall she'd spent a lifetime building. A wall she thought would keep her safe. A wall she thought would justify every sacrifice she'd made, including walking away from her own daughter. Vanessa slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold marble floor, her judicial robes pooling around her like black water. Her designer heels slipped off her feet. She didn't care who saw her now. Didn't care if the cameras came running. For the first time in years, she wasn't performing. She wasn't spinning, she wasn't defending the system. She was just a mother. And she had failed. In the silence of that hallway, Vanessa's mind replayed every excuse she had ever made to herself. Every time she told herself that leaving Chicago had been the right thing. That Grace would be better off with Papa Paul while she chased justice on the federal level. She had convinced herself that she could fix everything from the top down, rewrite the precedents, reform the appeals process, change the headlines, build something so strong that Grace, kids like her, would never have to face the kind of broken system that had failed Vanessa's generation. But it was a lie, because right now her daughter wasn't standing on a law school graduation stage. She wasn't holding a judicial clerkship or shaking hands with a senator. She was standing in a jail cell wearing chains, holding the weight of a system that had decided her life was disposable. And Vanessa had let it happen, because she wasn't there, not when it mattered. She stood slowly, her hands trembling as she smoothed her robes. The reporters were still waiting outside, the cameras, the microphones, the questions. They hadn't gone anywhere. But Vanessa didn't walk toward them. She turned and walked the other way, her security detail scrambling to catch up. "Ma'am, where are you going?" one of them called after her. She didn't answer, because for the first time in years, she didn't have a script. She didn't have a legal strategy, she just had a name: Grace. Back in her chambers, Vanessa shut the door behind her, shutting out the noise, the staff, the handlers. She stood there in the dark, staring at the photo on her bookshelf. A little girl with big brown eyes wearing a bright red coat, sitting on Papa Paul's lap in front of a tiny Christmas tree. Grace couldn't have been more than 5 years old in that picture. Vanessa remembered taking it the night before she left for Washington. She told herself she was doing it for them, for Grace, for the future. But now she realized she hadn't been building a future. She had been building distance, putting miles between herself and the one thing she was too afraid to face, the life she left behind. Vanessa sat down at her desk, opened her laptop and pulled up the federal case database. She typed in her daughter's name. Grace Harrington. One file. Thin. Too thin. She clicked it open. No defense witness list. No verified evidence chain. A single piece of surveillance footage, blurry, low quality, cropped at both ends. Vanessa's stomach sank. She knew what that meant. She'd seen it before. Edited evidence, rushed trials. Political favors disguised as justice. She had built an entire federal oversight system to stop this kind of corruption. Yet here it was, staring her in the face. And this time, it had a name she couldn't ignore. Grace. Her daughter. She kept digging. Court dockets, judge assignments, appellate reviews, and then she found it, an internal memo. Grace's case had been reassigned outside normal federal review procedures, straight to Judge Logan Kingsley's personal docket. No oversight, no questions asked. And just like that, it all came crashing down. Judge Kingsley. She knew that name. Too many complaints, too many rushed convictions, and somehow no federal review had ever touched him, until now. Little did anyone know what was coming. Vanessa leaned back in her leather chair, her heart pounding like it was trying to break free from her chest. She had to make a choice, right here, right now. Did she play it safe, protect her position, keep her title? Or did she burn it all down to save the very child she had spent her whole life pretending wasn't part of this fight? It wasn't even a question. She stood up, grabbed her phone, and made a call. Not to the press, not to her advisors, but to someone who owed her a favor. Someone who still had boots on the ground in Chicago. Someone who knew where the real records were kept. Because Vanessa Chambers wasn't just Grace's mother. She was a federal circuit judge with jurisdiction over Illinois. And for the first time in a long time, she was finally ready to fight the right battle. And this time she wasn't fighting for a headline. She was fighting for her daughter. Meanwhile, Chicago was never part of Vanessa Chambers' plan after she left. Not after she packed her bags all those years ago and promised herself she'd never look back. She told herself it was necessary. She told herself she was building something bigger, something better. But deep down she knew the truth. She hadn't just left Chicago, she had run from it. From the pain, from the memories, and most of all, from Grace. Vanessa had only been 29 when she made that choice, a young widow with a baby girl on her hip and no money to her name. Her husband, Marcus, had been gone less than a year. A construction accident on a Chicago highway had stolen him in a moment. One minute he was there, kissing Grace goodnight, and the next, gone. Just like that. Vanessa tried to hold it together for a while. Tried to be enough for her daughter, for herself, for the life they were supposed to have. But the walls of that tiny Southside apartment felt like they were closing in. Every street reminded her of what she'd lost. Every corner whispered his name. And then the offer came. A federal clerkship in Washington, D.C., a shot at law school, a way out. Papa Paul had begged her to think twice. He told her that Grace needed her more than the world needed another lawyer. But Vanessa didn't listen. She saw that letter as a lifeline, a ticket to something that might finally make the pain worth it. So she left. She left Grace in Papa Paul's arms, with promises that she'd come back, that she was doing this for them, that one day they'd understand. But days turned into months, months into years, and soon Chicago became a place she mentioned in speeches, not a place she ever planned to return to. Vanessa built her career, brick by brick. She worked her way from law school to federal court, from district to circuit to the kind of influence that made headlines. She wore power like armor. She learned to speak the language of jurisprudence, learned how to smile just enough without letting anyone get too close. She became exactly what the newspapers called her, the most influential federal judge of her generation. But somewhere along the way she forgot what she was really fighting for. She sent cards on birthdays, money for school supplies. She called on holidays when her calendar allowed. But she hadn't seen Grace face to face in over 10 years. She told herself Papa Paul had it under control. She told herself Grace was better off without her dragging all that grief into their home. She told herself a lot of things. But that phone call, that quiet voice on the other end, had ripped all those excuses to pieces. Vanessa stood in front of her office window, staring out at the city she used to believe she could change. D.C. had once felt like the center of the universe, but now it felt like a cage, a place built on polished lies and empty precedents, and she had played her part perfectly. Until now. She knew what she had to do. It wasn't a press release. It wasn't another appellate brief. It wasn't a headline. It was Chicago. It was Grace. She cancelled every meeting, cleared her calendar, told her clerk she needed personal time. They didn't question her, not at first, but the look in her eyes told them not to push, not today. The flight to Chicago felt longer than it should have. Every mile, every minute in the air pressed against her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. When the plane finally touched down, she stood at the gate for a moment, staring out at the tarmac like it might swallow her whole. But she stepped forward anyway. One foot, then the other. What they discovered next would destroy everything the federal courts believed about local justice. A car was waiting for Vanessa at O'Hare, but she didn't take it. She needed to see the city the way she used to, through her own eyes, not through tinted windows. So she walked, past the old church on State Street, past the corner store where she used to buy Grace candy after daycare, past the mural of civil rights leaders painted on the side of the old library, and finally to the front steps of the one place she never thought she'd stand again, Papa Paul's house. The paint was peeling. The porch light flickered like it had been fighting to stay alive for years, but it was still standing, just like he was. Vanessa stood at the bottom step, clutching her purse like it might somehow protect her from what she was about to face. She almost turned back, almost let her pride drag her away one more time. But then the door creaked open and there he was, Papa Paul, older, tired, but still standing. He didn't say a word, just stood there, staring at her like she was a ghost. Vanessa swallowed hard. "Hi, Papa Paul," she whispered. The air between them felt heavy, like every word she hadn't said in 10 years was sitting in that space, daring her to break the silence. Papa Paul stepped out onto the porch, his hands trembling just enough for her to notice. He didn't hug her, didn't yell. He just looked her dead in the eye and asked the only question that mattered. "What took you so long?" Vanessa's throat tightened, but she didn't look away. Not this time. "I was wrong," she whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought if I could fix the system, I could protect her. But I left her, and now she's paying for it." Papa Paul's jaw tightened, his voice cracking like old wood. "You didn't just leave her, Vanessa, you left all of us." She nodded, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "I know, and I'm here to fix it, if you'll let me." He didn't answer right away. He just stared at her for what felt like forever, and then slowly he stepped aside, holding the door open with a shaky hand. "Don't come in here to talk," he muttered. "Come in here to fight." Vanessa stepped inside because this time she wasn't running. She was going to fight for her daughter. And she wasn't leaving Chicago again until Grace was free. Stories of justice and family courage inspire people all around the world. Let us know what country and city you're watching from so we can see how far these powerful messages are reaching. Vanessa didn't waste a second after stepping into that old house. She didn't sit down. She didn't take off her coat. She didn't let herself get comfortable. Because none of this was comfortable. Not the chipped paint on the walls. Not the faint smell of black coffee and dust. Not the weight of Papa Paul's eyes watching her every move. She was back, but she wasn't welcome. Not yet. And she knew it. Papa Paul stood near the kitchen, arms crossed, his face a fortress of years spent holding this family together alone. She could feel his disappointment hanging in the air like thick smoke. But he didn't stop her when she pulled out her laptop and started working at the old dining table. The same table she used to do her homework on as a kid, back when life was still simple, back when she still believed in happily ever after. The house creaked around her as she connected to the federal database. Every key she pressed felt heavier than the last. She wasn't just looking at a file anymore. She was staring at the cracks in a system she had sworn to fix. And now those cracks had a name, Grace. She pulled up Judge Logan Kingsley's records. On paper he looked clean, 25 years on the bench, countless awards, commendations for his swift and decisive rulings. But Vanessa had seen this kind of profile before, the kind that smelled too good to be true. She dug deeper, case after case, same patterns, same outcomes. No jury, no defense witnesses, maximum sentences handed down like clockwork, especially to young black defendants. And just like Grace, almost every one of them had gone unnoticed by the press, buried under the weight of a system that thrived on silence. Vanessa leaned back in the chair, running her hands over her face. This wasn't just about her daughter anymore. This was bigger, so much bigger. But she couldn't afford to think about the big picture yet. Not now. Right now, she needed one thing. Proof. That's when the real truth emerged. Somewhere in this mess, there had to be someone who'd seen it happen. Someone who knew how Judge Kingsley's courtroom really worked. Someone who wasn't afraid to talk. She didn't have to look far. The next morning, while Vanessa sat scrolling through court records and phone logs, Papa Paul quietly set a cup of coffee in front of her. He didn't say much, but the way he stood there, shifting from foot to foot, told her he had something on his mind. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You remember Carol's boy, Derek?" Vanessa frowned, the name catching her off guard. "Derek Williams? He used to help me carry books home from the library?" Papa Paul nodded slowly. "He's not a boy anymore. He's a bailiff. Judge Kingsley's bailiff." Vanessa sat up straight, her pulse quickening. A bailiff, someone on the inside. Papa Paul leaned on the back of the chair, lowering his voice. "Word is, he's been looking real uncomfortable lately, like a man holding something he ain't proud of." Vanessa closed the laptop and stood. "Where do I find him?" Papa Paul grabbed his keys off the hook by the door. "I'll drive." They didn't speak much on the way there. The streets of Chicago passed by like ghosts of a life Vanessa had left behind. Every stop sign, every corner store, every old church, they all whispered the same thing. You can't run from what you left. They found Derek Williams at a small diner on the south side, sitting alone in a corner booth, with a plate of cold eggs and a cup of coffee that had probably gone bitter hours ago. He looked older than Vanessa remembered. Tired. Like life had worn him thin. When he saw her walking toward him, his eyes widened. He started to stand but stopped halfway, like he wasn't sure if he should run or stay. "Vanessa Chambers," he muttered under his breath. "Didn't think I'd ever see you back here." She slid into the booth across from him, folding her hands on the table. "I need your help, Derek." He let out a dry laugh. "Funny. I used to hear that all the time when we were kids. Never thought you'd come asking again." Papa Paul stood behind her like a quiet wall of strength, arms crossed, daring Derek to play games. But Derek didn't look like a man in the mood to joke. Vanessa leaned in. "It's about Grace." The color drained from his face. He sat back, running a hand over his jaw. "I figured. Word travels fast in this town. Then you know she's innocent." He didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, picking at the edge of the paper napkin like it held all the answers he didn't want to say out loud. "I've seen things," he whispered. "Things I shouldn't have let slide." Vanessa's heart pounded in her chest. "Tell me." He swallowed hard, glancing around the diner like the walls might have ears. "Judge Kingsley. He's been doing this for years. Moving cases onto his private docket, skipping reviews, ignoring evidence. And the prosecutors, most of them play along. They call it cleaning house, fast-track convictions, no press, no noise." Vanessa leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a razor-thin whisper. "Did you see them do it to Grace?" Derek closed his eyes like the weight of it was too much. "I did more than see it. I was there when they pulled her file. They passed it around like it was already decided. They didn't even bother reading the rest of her record." Vanessa clenched her fists under the table. "Why didn't you stop it?" His voice cracked. "Because I was a coward." The silence between them was sharp enough to cut glass. But Vanessa didn't have time for guilt. Not his, not hers. "You can make it right," she said. "You can testify. You can help me take him down." Derek looked up, his eyes haunted. "You don't understand. People have tried. They end up losing their jobs, or worse." Vanessa's voice was steady, sharper than it had ever been. "And if you don't, my daughter loses her life." He flinched, swallowed hard, and for a long moment he didn't speak. But then, slowly, he nodded. "I'll do it," he whispered. "I'll tell the truth." Vanessa exhaled, the air shaking in her chest like it had been trapped there for years. Because finally, after all this time, the wall was starting to crack. What followed would destroy everything. The truth about what really happened the night of the fire didn't start in a courtroom. It didn't start with a police report. And it sure as hell didn't start with Judge Logan Kingsley. It started long before that. It started with a notebook. Grace Harrington had always carried that old worn-out leather notebook with her, stuffed with sketches, wiring diagrams, code snippets, and scribbled notes no one but she could fully understand. To most people it looked like doodles, a teenager's messy hobby. But to Grace it was a map, a way to fix things no one else seemed to notice were broken. And if anybody had taken 5 minutes to actually ask her, they would have known exactly what she'd been working on. It had started months earlier, when the Bronzeville Community Center asked for volunteers to help improve the old building's security system. The back alley had become a hotspot for break-ins, vandalism, and worse. Kids walking home after evening programs were getting hurt in the dark corners of that building. So Grace had stepped up. She designed a motion sensor security system that could monitor the entire building. Cameras, lights, alarms. Safer for the kids, safer for the neighborhood. She'd spent weeks working on it. Late nights at her little desk by the window, Papa Paul sitting in his chair nearby, sipping coffee, watching her scribble plans and run calculations. She didn't do it for extra credit. She didn't do it for attention. She did it because it was the right thing to do, because somebody had to care. And if not her, then who? She met with the center's director, Mr. Leonard, every Tuesday after school. He'd given her the old blueprints, the maintenance logs, even let her walk the building with the janitor so she could see the wiring set up herself. She took notes on everything, labeled every circuit, every connection. It was all there, right in that notebook. But nobody in that courtroom ever asked about Mr. Leonard. Nobody even called him to testify, because the system didn't want the truth. It wanted a headline. It wanted a scapegoat. And Grace? She fit their story a little too perfectly. It all came crashing down 2 nights before the fire. City Councilman Robert Kane, one of Chicago's most powerful politicians, had been circling the Bronzeville Community Center like a vulture for months. The city had plans to sell off the building to developers, turn it into high-end condos and parking garages, but there was a problem. The community refused to let it go. The programs running there had kept that neighborhood alive. The kids needed it. The families needed it. And Grace? She was one of the loudest, quiet supporters they had. Not with words, but with actions. She showed up, she fixed things, she made the place better, and that made her dangerous to the people who wanted it gone, so they made a plan. A fire would solve everything. A fire would clear the way for demolition, and all they needed was someone to blame. They didn't even have to look far. Grace's plans, her sketches, her electrical diagrams, she'd left them at the center after her last volunteer session. She was scheduled to finish the security system installation the following week. But those plans never made it back to her hands. They ended up somewhere else entirely. Derek Williams remembered seeing them the day after the fire, in Judge Kingsley's chambers, sitting right there on the judge's desk. A file with Grace's name on it, stuffed with copies of her diagrams, labeled evidence. Derek knew something was wrong. He'd seen those plans on the community center's bulletin board just days before the fire. He'd watched Grace work on them in plain sight, in front of staff and volunteers, but suddenly they were being used as proof she had planned the whole thing. He tried to tell himself he was imagining things, tried to tell himself it wasn't his fight, but deep down he knew better. He'd seen Judge Kingsley do this before, shuffling files, pulling cases onto his private docket, fast-tracking convictions without blinking an eye. And now it was Grace, the footage. The prosecutor showed in court that grainy video. Derek had seen the original. The full tape showed Grace locking up the building after her volunteer shift, hours before the fire even started. But the version presented in court was cropped, blurry, stripped of the timestamps. It made it look like she was there right before the flames started, and nobody questioned it. Nobody dug deeper. Because that's how the system works when it's rigged. It doesn't have to lie outright. It just has to tell the version of the story that suits the people in power. Vanessa knew that better than anyone. She'd built her whole career fighting that kind of manipulation, and now she was staring it dead in the face. She closed her laptop and stood, pacing the floor of Papa Paul's living room. Derek sat on the couch, staring at the ground like it might swallow him whole. "Do you have access to the original footage?" she asked. Derek nodded slowly. "It's on a backup server at the courthouse. I can get it." Vanessa didn't hesitate. "Then we get it tonight." Derek swallowed hard. "If they catch me, they won't," Vanessa snapped, "because we're not going through the front door." Papa Paul raised an eyebrow from his chair. "You sure you still remember how this town works, baby girl?" Vanessa smirked for the first time in days. Better than they think. She grabbed her coat and turned to Derek. "We're done playing by their rules." Because if they wanted to burn the truth down, she was ready to light her own match. And this time they were all going to feel the heat. The consequences were just beginning. The courthouse looked different at night. It wasn't the kind of different you noticed in daylight, the shifting sun, the buzzing offices, the steady hum of lawyers walking in and out like bees in a hive. No, this was a colder kind of quiet, a dead, empty kind of quiet. The kind that made you feel like the walls themselves were holding their breath, listening for footsteps that weren't supposed to be there. Derek Williams knew those walls better than anyone. He'd walked them for years, standing outside Judge Kingsley's courtroom like a statue. He knew every creaky stair, every flickering hallway light, every busted lock they never bothered to fix. And right now, standing in the parking lot with Vanessa beside him, he felt like those walls were watching him for the first time. Vanessa adjusted her coat, pulling it tighter around her shoulders. "You sure you know where it's stored?" Derek nodded, but there was hesitation in his voice. "Basement level, room 12B. That's where they keep the archive drives." Vanessa glanced at the courthouse, her jaw tightening. "And the security?" Derek exhaled slowly. "Light after hours. It's just one guard at the front and cameras on every hallway." Vanessa turned to him, her voice low and sharp. "You're going to need to distract that guard. I'll take care of the rest." Derek rubbed the back of his neck, shifting on his feet like he was already regretting every life choice that brought him to this parking lot. "And what happens if you get caught?" Vanessa didn't hesitate. "I won't." He didn't believe her, not really, but she believed it enough for both of them. They moved quietly toward the back entrance. The side door near the employee parking lot had a keypad lock. Derek had watched maintenance workers reset it a dozen times. He punched in the numbers with shaking fingers. 1015, Judge Kingsley's birthday. Figures. The lock clicked. Vanessa slipped inside first, moving like someone who'd done this before. Because she had. Long before she was a headline, she was a hustler, a kid from the same streets they were trying to erase. She hadn't forgotten how to move in silence. She hadn't forgotten how to hunt for the truth when nobody wanted her to find it. Derek followed, keeping close behind her as they made their way down the dimly lit stairwell. Every step echoed louder than it should have. Every flicker of the overhead lights felt like a warning. When they reached the basement level, Derek grabbed her arm. "This is it. The room's down that hall. First door on the right." Vanessa nodded, her eyes narrowing. "Get that guard talking. Keep him busy." Derek swallowed hard and headed for the lobby without another word. Vanessa watched him go, then turned down the hall. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she moved toward the door marked 12B. She pulled a pair of gloves from her pocket, slipped them on, and reached for the doorknob. Locked. Of course. She glanced up at the camera above the door, then, without a second thought, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small can of compressed air, one of the oldest tricks in the book. She stepped onto the edge of the baseboard, stretched just high enough to frost the camera lens. The camera's red light flickered, then dimmed. She dropped back down and pulled a thin metal pick from her pocket. She'd learned a lot of things in law school, but this she'd learned on the streets long before she ever saw the inside of a federal courthouse. The lock clicked after 30 long seconds. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft thump. The room was freezing. Rows of metal shelves lined the walls, each stacked with black plastic cases labeled by date and docket number. She scanned the shelves, her breath catching when she saw it. State Vice Grace Harrington. Her hands shook as she grabbed the case and flipped it open. Inside was a single hard drive, no backup, no secondary file. Just this, the only real record of what happened that night. She tucked the drive into her bag and turned to leave, but just as she reached for the door, she heard it. Footsteps, getting closer. Vanessa held her breath, pressing herself flat against the shelf as the door handle rattled. She could hear voices outside. Derek's voice, too loud, too nervous, and the guard asking questions. She knew that tone. She knew that danger. They were coming. Her eyes darted to the air vent at the top of the back wall. It was barely wide enough, but it was the only shot she had. She pulled a small multi-tool from her bag and started working the screws loose as quietly as she could. Her heart pounded harder with every twist. The voices outside were getting louder. The door handle shook again. Vanessa yanked the last screw free and pushed the vent cover aside. She shoved her bag through first, then pulled herself up, scraping her knees against the metal edge. She didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Just as the door flew open, she disappeared inside the vent. She crawled through the tight space, every inch feeling like it was trying to crush her. She didn't let it. She kept moving until she saw the faint glow of exit lights ahead. She kicked the vent cover loose and dropped down into a dark maintenance corridor. She hit the ground hard, clutching the drive to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Outside, Derek was already waiting in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. Vanessa threw open the passenger door and slid inside, breathing heavy. She didn't have to say a word. She held up the drive and Derek's eyes went wide. "You got it." Vanessa nodded, her voice sharp and steady. "I got it." And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally getting her daughter back. What happened next would surprise everyone. By the time Vanessa and Derek made it back to the house, it was nearly sunrise. The sky was just starting to shift, turning from black to deep grey, the kind of colour that made the world feel like it hadn't decided whether to wake up or stay asleep. Papa Paul was waiting on the porch. He didn't ask where they'd been, didn't have to. One look at Vanessa's face told him everything he could see, the weight in her shoulders, the fire in her eyes. She was chasing something big. And this time she wasn't backing down. Vanessa climbed the steps, her knees aching from the night's adrenaline finally wearing off. She held the drive tight in her hand, like it might vanish if she let go. Derek followed close behind, looking like he'd aged 5 years in one night. They stepped into the house, shutting the door quietly behind them. Papa Paul turned and walked back to his chair without a word, sitting down slow, like his whole body was carrying more years than it should have. Vanessa sat at the table and slid the drive onto the wood surface. Papa Paul leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "What's on it?" Vanessa exhaled, running her hand across her face. The truth, the full footage. Grace locking up the community center hours before the fire. Derek nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. It clears her, no question. Papa Paul sat back, letting the words sink in. His jaw clenched like he was holding something back, but then his voice cracked open, rough and tired. "Good. Now tell me what you're going to do with it." Vanessa swallowed hard. She'd spent her whole career knowing how to move next. She always had a plan, always had an answer. But this wasn't DC. This wasn't politics. This was her daughter. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't know if the system she helped build was capable of fixing what it had broken. "I'll send it to the Federal Oversight Committee," she said softly. "Get it to my people. They'll review it, build a case." Papa Paul slammed his hand on the table, making Derek jump. "You really think that's going to be fast enough?" Papa Paul growled. "You really think they're going to rush to save a black girl from Chicago when it's easier to let her rot?" Vanessa flinched, but she knew he wasn't wrong. She'd seen how slow the machine moved. She'd seen how many files got buried, how many names disappeared before anyone ever paid attention. But she didn't have another play. Not yet. "I can make them listen," she insisted. "I have jurisdiction. I have leverage." Papa Paul leaned forward, his voice shaking now. "Leverage doesn't mean a damn thing if Grace doesn't make it through next week." Vanessa's throat tightened. "What do you mean?" Derek shifted in his seat, his voice low. "Word is Judge Kingsley's pushing to move her to state prison. They're expediting the transfer." Vanessa's stomach dropped. State prison. Grace wouldn't survive in there. Not as a 17-year-old girl who didn't even belong in the system to begin with. "No," Vanessa whispered, standing so fast her chair scraped across the floor. "I won't let that happen." Papa Paul stood too, his eyes locked on hers. "Then stop playing their game, Vanessa. Go public, expose them." Vanessa shook her head. "If I go public now, they'll shut the whole thing down. They'll bury the evidence before it ever sees the light of day." Papa Paul took a step closer, his voice rough like gravel. "And if you wait, they'll bury her." Vanessa turned away, pacing the room like she was fighting a war inside her own skin. She knew Papa Paul was right. She knew the system better than anyone. They wouldn't protect Grace, they'd protect themselves, their careers, their reputations, and they'd sacrifice her daughter to do it. She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to breathe, trying to think. And that's when Papa Paul spoke again, softer this time. "You know what she needs, Vanessa? She needs to see you fight. Not as the federal judge. Not as some headline, as her mother." Vanessa froze. Because that's what this had always been about. Not precedent. Not politics. Not power. It was about Grace, her daughter, the little girl she'd left behind. The little girl who had called her, not to beg, not to plead, but to remind her of the promise she'd made all those years ago, to protect the voiceless. Vanessa turned back to Derek. "I need every file you can pull on Judge Kingsley. Every case he's fast-tracked, every kid he's railroaded." Derek nodded, his face pale but determined. "I'll get it." Vanessa grabbed the drive off the table and held it tight. "And I need someone who can make noise, someone who can make the world pay attention." Papa Paul raised an eyebrow. "You got someone in mind?" Vanessa nodded slowly, a fire sparking in her chest. Yeah, I do. Because Vanessa Chambers wasn't just going to send this up the chain. She wasn't just going to whisper behind closed doors. She was going to burn the whole damn thing down in front of the entire world. And this time she wasn't waiting for permission. The final impact would change everything forever. Vanessa didn't sleep that night. She couldn't, because every minute that passed felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She knew how this worked. If she didn't move fast, the system would tighten its grip, and Grace would disappear deeper into the machine, maybe for good. So while the rest of Chicago slept, Vanessa got to work. She reached out to someone she hadn't spoken to in years, someone who knew how to turn whispers into headlines. Her name was Maya Brooks, a hard-hitting, no-nonsense investigative journalist who had built her career on stories the mainstream media was too scared to touch. She didn't work for the big networks. She didn't wear fancy suits or sit behind a shiny desk. She worked out of a tiny community newsroom, 2 blocks from where Vanessa grew up. Maya had always said the truth didn't need a spotlight, just someone brave enough to carry it, and Vanessa knew Maya was the only one who wouldn't flinch. She sent a simple message. I have something you need to see. Meet me at Papa Paul's place. No cameras, no crew, just you. Maya showed up less than an hour later, standing on that old wooden porch, with a backpack slung over one shoulder, and a look on her face that said she already knew this was bigger than anything they'd ever touched before. They sat at the kitchen table, just like they used to when they were kids, back when they dreamed of changing the world before they even understood what that really meant. Vanessa laid out everything. The footage, the court records, Derek's testimony, the pattern of Judge Kingsley's fast-tracked convictions, the way Grace had been railroaded without anyone ever asking a single real question. Maya didn't take notes. She didn't record a word. She just listened. When Vanessa finished, the room was so quiet you could hear the old clock ticking on the wall. Maya leaned back, letting out a long breath. Damn. Vanessa nodded, her voice steady but shaking on the inside. I need the world to see this, now. Maya rubbed her chin, thinking, you know going public means war, right? You know they'll come after you, after all of us. Vanessa didn't hesitate. Let them. Maya stared at her for a long moment, like she was searching for something, and when she found it, she nodded. All right, she whispered. Let's light it up. By sunrise, Maya had the story drafted, but she didn't publish it the way people expected. She didn't run it through the usual news channels. She didn't blast it across corporate networks. She dropped it where the people would find it first, on social media. A single post. A thread, actually. It started with a name, who is Grace Harrington, and then it unfolded, frame by frame, fact by fact, the footage, the manipulated timestamps, the missing witnesses, the patterns of abuse under Judge Kingsley, the push to rush Grace into state prison. Maya didn't hold back. She named names. She called out the prosecutors, the judges, the politicians who stood by while it all happened. And then she dropped the final bombshell. Grace Harrington was the daughter of Federal Circuit Judge Vanessa Chambers. That one line hit like an earthquake. Within minutes, the thread started spreading. First in Chicago, then across Illinois, then across the country. People started asking questions. How did this happen? How does a teenage girl get sentenced to life with no defense? How does this happen under the watch of a federal judge herself? The noise grew fast, too fast for anyone to control, and just like that, the federal courts couldn't stay silent any longer. Vanessa's phone lit up. Calls from Washington, her clerk, the chief judge, the judicial council. They wanted explanations, they wanted damage control, they wanted her to step in front of the cameras and spin it. But Vanessa didn't take their calls. Instead, she stood in front of Papa Paul's old television, watching the story she had tried to bury for years rise to the surface for the whole world to see. Maya wasn't done. She followed up with interviews. Grace's teachers, neighbors, kids from the community center who remembered her building that security system. They spoke up one after another, not as activists, not as political pawns, but as people who knew the truth. People who had watched a kid try to make her community better, only to be framed for something she didn't do. And the more they spoke, the louder the movement grew. Protests started forming outside the courthouse. Signs with Grace's name, chants calling for justice, for accountability, for change. And in the middle of all that noise, Grace sat in a cold cell, unaware that the world outside was finally waking up to her story. Papa Paul stood behind Vanessa, his voice low and tired but proud. "She's not invisible anymore," he whispered. Vanessa swallowed hard, her chest tightening with a mix of fear and hope. "No," she whispered back, "not anymore." Because the whole world was watching now. And for the first time in a long, long time, the system didn't get to control the narrative. What happened next shocked the entire nation. The crowd outside the courthouse grew bigger by the hour. What started as a handful of neighbors holding homemade signs had turned into a wall of voices. People were spilling into the streets, students, teachers, church leaders, folks from every part of Chicago and beyond. But inside the courthouse, it was still quiet. Too quiet. Derek Williams stood just outside Judge Kingsley's chambers, staring at the door like it might swallow him whole. His palms were sweating, his throat tight. He knew what had to be done. He knew he was the only one who could do it. But standing there, knowing what this would cost him, it made his knees feel weak. He could hear the judge's voice on the other side of that door, laughing with the district attorney like nothing outside mattered. Like the protests were just noise, like Grace Harrington was already gone. Derek clenched his fists, fighting every instinct that told him to turn around and walk away. He had done that too many times already. He had stood silent while kid after kid disappeared into the system. He had watched it happen. He had let it happen. But not this time, not to her. He reached for the door handle but froze when a voice called his name. "Derek." He turned to see Vanessa standing at the end of the hallway. No press, no cameras. Just her holding a folder in her hand and a look in her eyes that stopped him cold. She walked toward him slowly like she knew exactly what he was thinking. "I know you're scared," she said quietly. Derek swallowed hard, nodding. "I've never been this scared in my life." Vanessa stopped in front of him, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Good. That means you're about to do the right thing." Derek let out a shaky breath. "I don't even know where to start." Vanessa handed him the folder. Inside was every document Maya had published, the footage, the court records, the proof, all of it. But it wasn't for Judge Kingsley. Not yet. "It starts with the press," she said. "You go out there. You tell them everything. On camera, on record, no more hiding." Derek shook his head. "You don't understand. They'll fire me. I'll lose everything." Vanessa stepped closer. "And if you don't, you'll lose yourself." Derek looked past her toward the front doors, where the muffled sound of chanting echoed through the marble halls. He could hear them calling Grace's name. He could feel the weight of every life he'd watched slip through this courthouse. He knew she was right. He had to do this. He had to say it out loud. He turned away from the judge's chambers and walked toward the front of the courthouse, his legs feeling like concrete with every step. But when he reached those doors, when he stepped out into the sunlight and saw the sea of faces staring back at him, something shifted. He wasn't scared anymore. Not of the system. Not of the judge. Not of the cost. Because for the first time, he realized the real power wasn't behind those doors. It was out here in the people who refused to stay silent. He climbed the steps slowly, holding the folder tight in his hand. The press rushed toward him, cameras flashing, microphones pushing closer. Derek cleared his throat, his voice shaking as he raised the folder for everyone to see. "My name is Derek Williams," he began, his voice cracking through the noise. "I've worked inside this courthouse for over 15 years, and I'm here to tell you it's broken." The crowd fell silent. Every camera turned toward him. Every microphone reached closer. "I watched Judge Logan Kingsley railroad case after case," Derek continued. "I watched him silence defense attorneys. I watched him fast-track convictions without proper evidence. And I watched him frame Grace Harrington for something she didn't do." He held up the folder higher. "I have the proof, the original footage, the real evidence they tried to hide. And I'm not staying silent anymore." The crowd erupted. Reporters shouted questions, people started crying. Some started chanting his name, but Derek didn't stay to answer. He handed the folder to the nearest reporter and stepped back, his chest heaving like he'd just outrun a hurricane. And in that moment, he felt free. Vanessa watched from the doorway, her heart pounding. She knew what Derek had just done. He'd just put a target on his back. But he'd also cracked the whole damn system wide open. She stepped outside, standing beside him. No title, no badge. Just a mother standing with a man who finally chose to do the right thing. And for the first time in her life, Vanessa Carter didn't feel alone in the fight. Because now the world was watching, and they weren't backing down. What came next would destroy everything. The courtroom wasn't the same, not anymore. The walls didn't feel as high, the air didn't feel as heavy. The people sitting on those hard wooden benches, they weren't just spectators this time. They were witnesses. They were the reason this hearing even existed. Because without them, without their noise, without their pressure, none of this would have ever seen the light of day. Grace sat at the defense table, but this time she wasn't alone in that quiet, terrifying way. The table wasn't empty. Her attorneys sat on either side of her. Behind her, Vanessa, Papa Paul, Maya, Derek, and a courtroom full of people who now knew the truth. Federal District Judge Patricia Monroe called the courtroom to order. She had been assigned by the Federal Oversight Committee after Judge Kingsley was forced to recuse himself under mounting pressure. But this wasn't just a hearing for Grace anymore. It was a hearing for justice itself. Judge Monroe began to read the findings of the independent federal review. Every word felt like it landed with the weight of a hammer. Evidence tampered, cases reassigned, defendants silenced, public defenders underfunded, court clerks pressured, and behind it all, a pipeline designed to push black and brown kids out of their neighborhoods and into cells. The courtroom shifted with every page she turned. The prosecutor tried to speak up, but Judge Monroe shut him down with a single look. This wasn't his stage anymore. This court recognizes the systematic violations of due process and judicial integrity that have taken place under this jurisdiction, Judge Monroe announced, her voice slicing through the silence. Grace held her breath, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Judge Monroe continued, "In light of these findings, this court hereby nullifies the standing conviction of Grace Harrington." And then she began reading names, one after another. Every single one of the 47 other cases Derek had helped expose. The room broke, tears, gasps, hands flying over mouths. Families clutching each other like they were afraid it wasn't real. Grace covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as the words hit her like a tidal wave. Not just for her. For all of them. Vanessa reached forward, wrapping her arms around her daughter's trembling shoulders. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt Grace finally exhale. Finally breathe. Because justice, real justice, had finally started to move. Judge Monroe didn't stop there. She turned her attention to the state prosecutor's table. This court further orders a federal review of prosecutorial conduct, including but not limited to the willful suppression of exculpatory evidence, improper case assignments, and unethical agreements with real estate developers tied to the displacement of affected communities. How you could feel the panic ripple across the state's legal team. They hadn't just lost, they'd been exposed. Judge Monroe's final words rang like thunder. Effective immediately. This courtroom will be placed under federal oversight until a full judicial audit is completed. The gavel fell, and just like that, the pipeline collapsed. As the courtroom emptied, people rushed to hug Grace. Families gathered, tears falling freely. Reporters swarmed, but nobody cared about cameras anymore. This moment wasn't for show. This moment was for them. Vanessa stood to the side, watching her daughter move through the crowd. People hugged her, thanked her. Some just held her hand, whispering thank you over and over again. And Grace? She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Because sometimes the quietest voice leaves the loudest mark. Papa Paul stood next to Vanessa, gripping his cane with one hand, wiping his face with the other. "She did it," he whispered. Vanessa nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "No, we did." Grace finally reached them. She didn't say a word. She just walked into Vanessa's arms and held on like she never wanted to let go. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the cameras, not the headlines, not the politics. Just this, just them. Together again. As they walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, the crowd erupted. People lined the steps, chanting Grace's name, holding signs that read, Justice for all 48, and end the pipeline. But Grace didn't wave. She didn't raise her fist. She didn't give a speech. She just held her mother's hand on one side and Papa Paul's hand on the other, and together they walked. Not to escape the spotlight, not to run from the fight, but to step fully into it. Because justice didn't end with the sound of a gavel. It started with the people who refused to give up, and now they had no intention of stopping. Thank you to everyone who typed innocent, and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and justice. Until next time, keep believing in the power of truth.